Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Given the recent announcement of the impending declaration of St. John Henry Newman as the 38th Doctor of the Church, it's more important than ever for you and I to revisit and rethink about the conversation of education from a Catholic paradigm and what that means. Joining me to have that conversation is Jared Staudt, Director of Content for Exodus 90, the editor of Renewing Catholic Schools, How to Regain a Catholic Vision in a Secular Age. And we're talking about his most recent book, Words Made Flesh, the Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education. Jared, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, always a joy as usual. And I want to begin by, for the sake of our listeners especially, shedding light on the legacy of John Henry Newman with regard to thinking rightly about education and therefore Catholic education.
He tells us that the ultimate value of education is not something useful, right? That's what we always think about in terms of education. We go to school so that we can get a job and we can make money. And it's not that he denies the importance of those goods, but he says ultimately we go to school so that our minds can be shaped, not that we can do something so that we can become someone, to be more fully who we are called to be. So he said the value of a liberal education is the cultivation of the mind itself. And he really pushed back towards the over-specialization that he saw creeping up in education, that you're basically in silos. You look at one particular academic discipline and it's totally cut off from all of the others, and we get a bunch of fragmented knowledge. And he insisted, as we're pursuing this cultivation of the intellect, to approach knowledge as a unified whole, so that we can have a unified vision of reality itself.
Now, considering that, he's not saying this in a vacuum. He is presenting this as the perennial Catholic model for educating the soul, and the Catholic Church used to drive that, and that's what led to the entire academic enterprise, and especially Western civilization. But as you rightly note in your book, the Catholic Church is no longer that driving force for the educational paradigm and overarching worldview. Could you please comment on what that has done to the academic sphere today?
Well, the state never was the primary force in education as a whole until the 19th century. So the last 200, little plus years has turned education from a refinement of mind and soul into this utilitarian preparation for the national workforce. So we view education differently than everyone else throughout history. Education as we know it, though, was developed by the Catholic Church. Even the first public schools. What do we mean by that? Well, schools that are free and open to the public. They were actually started by religious orders. And so when the church is running a school, it's situating knowledge and skills within the ultimate purpose of human life, pointing us to this deeper fulfillment of who we are, because education ultimately is not geared just towards success in this life. I mean, we do want to set our children up well, but it's geared towards eternal life.
Right.
And that's the proper context of education throughout all of history until very recently.
Jared, I completely agree with you, and that loss of an eternal telos for education has only served to destroy souls. But for the average parent, all they can think about is educating a child is expensive, so I hope that this is going to pay off in terms of a well-paying job. What's the virtuous answer, or at least a virtuous way to reconsider that?
It's a difficult choice for parents, and I do think that even though I advocate strongly for Catholic education, it is a process of discernment for each family, because unfortunately, parents tell me this, that many times they're not able to find a Catholic education that is truly Catholic. And so for the last 60 years, many Catholic schools have simply been trying to imitate secular schools. And in a way, they want to compete with them to say, oh, look, well, they're doing this, they're doing that. We're doing those things too, right? You know,
right.
We can play the same game as everybody else. And so I do challenge Catholic schools to say, we have a great heritage and legacy of over 2,000 years, because we've inherited the Greco-Roman approach to education as well.
Right.
So we have this very rich legacy. We can integrate it with modern advancements, but we don't have to be chasing after these secular standards and subordinating what we do to them. And so, as you said, parents have this expectation of secular success. The schools, many times, are actually trying to prove to them that they can actually do things just the way that the secular schools do them. What I argue in the book is that we need to come back to the heart of education.
Mm-hmm.
Because how can we tell our students that the faith is most important when it's simply an add-on? When you think
Right.
about all the time that children spend in school, Monday through Friday, the bulk of those days throughout most of the months of the year, that's a lot of time. And then we say, but we'll go to Mass on Sunday for an hour, and then, maybe you'll go to, a class for an hour or youth ministry for a couple of hours. And we're just kind of adding the faith in as if it were something extra. Well, the kids pick up on that.
Right.
And they say, well, I guess it's not very important. So the key task, in my opinion, right now for Catholic education is integration. The faith is at the center, and that's what provides coherency for the whole. It's what gives it direction, and which actually makes it to have the most impact upon the students.
Considering that, I wonder if you could also speak to that point you raised before, which had to do with Catholic schools willingly watering down the Catholic identity. More and more are trying to identify as college prep institutions, competing with private schools, but also larger public schools. And the faith then becomes, like you mentioned, this ancillary aspect, if you will, that's just sprinkled on the general STEM-based education. If you could comment on that as a holistic system, and how ought we to think about that?
It's very difficult to address this whole process of, as you said, watering down, because the 1960s was the turning point, as it really was for many things. But at that point, we had over 5 million students in Catholic education. Even going back to, the Third Plenary Synod of Bishops in Baltimore, they actually said that parents had to send their kids to Catholic school, so it was actually seen as a duty, and whenever possible. So how was that actually realistic for parents? Well, we had a lot of religious teaching in the schools, and the religious were able, because of their vocation, to integrate everything through the faith. Well, in the 1960s, there was really a kind of a perfect storm that came together. A lot of those religious simply left. There was a great crisis of the religious life at that time. And as we know, there's even been an enormous crisis of vocations following that. And so all of a sudden, you're hiring lay teachers. And even right now, most of our lay teachers are trained in public universities. I know this because I was an associate superintendent. So they're not being trained in a Catholic vision. And so they're coming in, well, then all of a sudden it's no longer natural. It's no longer at the center. What do they know? Well, they know what they've been trained in. And so this is part of the reason why the secular standards have become the model. Because as lay people took over for religious, they brought in what they knew and then had to rely on others, like the priest to come in occasionally, or simply going to Mass and enabling that to fulfill the religious mission of the school, rather than having it permeate the whole. But I will say, and I've been witnessing this happen over the last 10 years especially, of course the roots go back even farther, but there really is a kind of renaissance right now. It's still a minority, but a lot of lay people are stepping up and taking this mission farther again.
I'm talking with Dr. Jared Staudt. He is a prolific author, director of content for Exodus 90, and author of Words Made Flesh, the Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Dr. Jared Staudt, Director of Content for Exodus 90, author of Words Made Flesh, the Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education. I greatly encourage all parents to procure a copy of this. Read it and start thinking about what the Church's paradigm for education actually means for the sake of our children, and also for older children, if you're capable of reading this and thinking rightly about education, because it forms us to think differently about the truth. So, Jared, I want to pick up where we left off about this rising renaissance, that we have seen how the STEM-based education model, as utilitarian as it has outstandingly failed. It's been for want of a better expression, magnificent failure in terms of maintaining and increasing devoted practice of the faith and therefore devoted love of Jesus Christ.
I would say that modern education has failed across the board. It's almost a joke, but it's a very tragic one. Going around and asking young people to tell you anything about American history, let alone the history of Western civilization. They can't do it. So we have focused on a more utilitarian approach. But like I said, we have mass ignorance of the young. But also, even with this farther approach with STEM and things like that, our students don't actually know how to do things either. So it's not even succeeding on the level of utilitarianism, right? Because it's not very useful. What I actually see is a lot of young people are simply wasting their time in school, because they're not learning how to think. They're not being exposed to the riches of history. In a way, they're actually being taught how bad history is. And they're not actually being trained to do anything.
Right.
So what is happening? I don't know. What I actually advocate in the book, and this is why it's called Words Made Flesh, right? We have the Word who was made flesh for us, and that shows us that Catholic education needs to be very incarnational and sacramental. That is, we teach the truth, but I think what's often missing on the Catholic side is incarnating that into the lives of the students. So I'm not actually against utility in education, but that's not the driving force.
Right.
Can we give them what's highest and then actually do a better job in modern education in teaching them how to live concretely, practically in the world, because we don't know how to live any longer, like even on the most basic of levels.
Yeah, that's horrendously disappointing and yet very true. And just from a personal perspective too, I was brought up in that utilitarian materialist worldview, and I personally witnessed and lived how detrimental that is. Just on a social perspective within the church then, Jared, because you're at the forefront of witnessing and thinking about this. Why do you think we still keep beating that drum? Or why haven't we learned by now?
I have found that many educators are afraid to do anything differently. There's a kind of security in saying, well, we're following the standards.
Right.
Even though the current model, let's say it really became dominant in Catholic schools in the 1960s. Well, as far as educators know right now, that's it. You know what I mean? They don't know anything prior. That's the status quo, and it's actually now become traditional for us. And especially if you have teachers who are trained in state schools, if you ask them to think outside the box, to do things differently, I know from experience that panic sets in. I don't know, or the parents are going to be mad, or that's just not how we do things. So I am advocating, like, now is the time to make adjustments, because what we are doing isn't working on any level, because we're not handing on the faith. A lot of our students are not able to read and to think deeply and to articulate themselves clearly. And they're not well trained practically either. And I think we can do a better job at all three of those things, right? If we think, having a relationship with God, forming the mind, but then also forming the body and the praxis of the body in the world today. I think Catholics could be great at that. And we can't take that for granted any longer when people don't know who they are and they don't, understand the relationship of body and soul any longer. We need to really sink roots deeply into the soil of our humanity and of the natural world, and to awaken our students even at that level, simply to looking at reality, appreciating it, understanding it, and living well in the world today.
You raise a crucial point, too, that I'd love for you to enlighten us on, and that has to do with this very materialist, utilitarian STEM model of education. We see that even Catholic schools push children towards excellence as determined by state-measured scores and whatnot. But the areas that we don't expect excellence are, like you mentioned, the humanities, unless, with the exception of those things that the state seems to have a say in, the languages, especially English and literature. So those things we push because there's a competitive edge. But for those things that raise us to think critically and well, especially theology, we're willing to embrace mediocrity and tell ourselves that this is sufficient.
Well, in the area of teaching the faith in particular, because that in the modern world becomes reduced to sentiment.
Right.
And that often is what happens in Catholic education. I mean, I know that for a fact from experience on many different levels. But the irony is, when you teach for a test, students don't learn because it's not a sufficient way of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you do teach the humanities well, I mean, you mentioned literature and having competitive edge, but literature, even when you look at the AP and other standards, has become ideological.
Right.
They're not focused simply on reading deeply, thinking well, and so forth. It really is about an agenda. But when you do teach the humanities well, and this is proven, students do better on those standardized tests. So the test can't become an end.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of end or telos, right, that goal is that?
Right.
To simply say, I want you to perform well on a standardized test. There has to be something deeper for the students to actually sink their teeth into, to care about. I would even go so far as to fall in love with, because students will not learn, Simone Weil said this, unless they're led by delight.
Uh-huh.
And I would say whether it's a public school or Catholic school, we're generally lacking in that area. Not helping the students simply to appreciate the great leisure, the privilege of being able to read the most important things. Most children throughout human history did not have that amount of time. That's what the word school even means, schole, leisure. Very few children in history had the privilege of being able to read, to think, to contemplate the most important things of life, even though, like I said, a lot of our students today aren't doing those things. But that's what they should have the opportunity to do. And when we do those things, right, there's a transformation within us. And the least useful thing, right, we say that these are goods in and of themselves, contemplation of the truth, end up being very useful secondarily. Because when you can think, you can do anything. And even tech companies have realized this. I've assembled a number of articles where tech companies have said that they would prefer to hire somebody with a humanities degree than with a degree related to technology. Because if you get a degree related to technology, all you know how to do are the things that you were trained to do.
Right.
But if you have a degree in humanities, well, you're able to learn whatever's being taught to you. You're able to adapt and to think critically. And so that's actually the most important thing you can do, even to prepare yourself for work.
Yep. My guest is Dr. Jared Staudt, and he's really calling us to task on rethinking how we form the minds of our children, not just for excellence in career, but ultimately heavenly glory. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, speaking with Dr. Jared Staudt, Director of Content for Exodus 90 and the author of Words Made Flesh, the Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education. Jared, like you mentioned, there is a burgeoning movement to order children towards the study of the liberal arts so that they can think well, that they may live the good life, and with those skills developed, thinking rightly, living rightly, they can then perform excellently in any area of career, which is a real reordering of what we've been trained to think education is, and what if we can pick up from there?
Yes, absolutely. And the point is more relevant right now than ever before because of so-called artificial intelligence. Because a lot of things that everyone's been studying will be able to be done by a computer.
Right.
So everyone said, go out and get a practical degree, and then you'll be able to get a job in this or that.
Right.
Well, they're not going to be able to. But the one thing that artificial intelligence can't do is to be intelligent, ironically, right?
Yep.
And so what do we really need to double down on is fostering true intelligence. What does that mean? An understanding, making connections, being creative. These are things that a liberal arts education can do, really inspiring our students, truth, goodness, and beauty that develop and shape our humanity, because the machines can never take the place of genuine humanity.
Yep. And because of that, when we think about, like you mentioned, they can't take the place of genuine humanity. So when we think about the role of the human person, the job market is going to alter, it's going to shift. But human ingenuity, innovation, and the capacity for co-creation continues. So if you could speak to especially those involved in Catholic education right now about rethinking and reordering the paradigm of education.
I think what we need most at this time is wisdom. Wisdom is not simply knowledge. And I think this is where a lot of people go wrong, because they say, well, we can get a lot of knowledge from the internet. True. There's really a tsunami of information. But what do you do with that? What's worth prioritizing? How do you order it? What is it all for? Artificial intelligence can never figure out those questions,
right.
And artificial intelligence won't be able to direct itself. Now, I know that there are programs that they say are self-learning and that will continue to grow and develop, but who's going to keep that in check? If we do not foster wisdom, which is the right ordering of knowledge towards its end, if we do not foster that kind of wisdom, we will simply become passive to the developments in technology, and they will overwhelm us.
You bring up the crucial question, too, that modern man is clamoring for but refusing to return to the cross for the answer for, and that is the question of happiness and the pursuit of happiness, properly speaking. Parents, well-meaning, order their children towards utilitarian education and therefore jobs, but we are seeing statistically now that happiness is at an all-time low, whatever that means in terms of measurability. If you could comment on that, please.
Modern culture views happiness as a subjective feeling of fulfillment or well-being. And we know that happiness is not a feeling, and yet we can trust people when they tell us they're not happy. That's accurate, right?
Right.
But how would they possibly know what happiness is without a liberal education? Human beings are not born with an instruction manual. Squirrels simply know how to be a squirrel by instinct. Human beings don't have those kinds of instincts. What we will do, because of the fall, we will actually tend towards animality. And we will give in to our feelings and pleasures, these kind of base instincts. But that will never satisfy us because we are rational beings.
Yeah.
And a liberal education is ordered towards the development of our rationality, which is perfected by virtue. And if we are not even aiming to give that to our children, and from a young age they're learning simply to follow their own feelings what people say in modern culture, to follow your own heart, even though the Bible tells us that the human heart is evil. Right? But if we simply just fall into following the desires of our own heart rather than being guided and directed by reason, then there's a very small chance, without the drastic intervention of divine grace, that we will find happiness.
And therein lies the issue. Without a proper formation, let alone a reclamation of the meaning of happiness, we're not going to find happiness. So you provide a series of steps in the earlier parts of your book. About, if you could walk parents through those steps, like encounter the God who is truth, if you could walk us through those necessary steps for forming a life in pursuit of true happiness.
This is important because Pope Benedict XVI said that, Catholic education has done a pretty good job educating the intellect. Now, we know, of course, there's varying results there. But he says very significantly, perhaps we have neglected the will. And that's at a talk that he gave at the Catholic University of America. And so the steps of Catholic education I actually drew out of that talk. And he says that encountering Jesus Christ is at the foundation. It's actually the very purpose of Catholic education.
Right.
And when we encounter Jesus Christ as the most foundational step, it then actually opens our minds to the truth. Because as we've eroded any concept of seeking the truth, it's actually also damaged faith, right? But Pope Benedict has always said that faith and reason support one another in their own integrity. So encountering Jesus Christ, which makes us open to learning the truth, which is very hard to get students to be open, right? So Jesus Christ, who is the Word made flesh, opens them to the truth. But then here comes that step. Perhaps we've neglected the will. How do they respond to the truth? And this is where Pope Benedict said we have to have a development of freedom to actually desire rightly, to desire what is good, and to choose it, because education will be incomplete without it. The proper context for doing that is the integration into culture and community, because Pope Benedict, echoing a previous Vatican document, said that the entire goal of Catholic education is the integration of faith, life, and culture. And so this is another area where we're really lacking.
Right.
That how do we encounter Jesus Christ and learn the truth and respond to the good and true freedom? It's by being built up in relationship with others, being mentored by them, informed in the context of the school community, so that we can then go out and serve, because that's what a Christian does. So we received all these gifts in Catholic education, but what do we do with them? That we enter into our vocation, and we pour out our lives for God and others. And here's the irony. That's what makes us happy. And so that's the ultimate goal. I've walked through 6 steps. The sixth step is entering into true happiness, which we find, as Jesus said, by giving ourselves up for God and others. He says, if you want to find yourself, you have to lose yourself, right? And so it is in communion with others, responding to our vocation, sacrificing our lives so that we can find it truly being fulfilled and knowing the truth, loving the good, and entering into it in communion with others.
And that's precisely why, as we reconsider the work of Catholic education, we can look back to St. John Henry Newman, whom we began this entire series with. And Jared, if I may ask you to also comment, John Henry Newman utilized the language of the intellect and the heart, but for some weird reason, today when we look at especially Catholic education institutions, reaching the heart means being as emotive as possible, and that's equated to an encounter with Jesus Christ. Could you please speak to the truth of the matter and how John Henry Newman actually meant the phrase?
Well, the heart in the spiritual tradition is the center of our being, of our soul, where we can find God. And Newman was very personal in all that he did. That he had a very personalist view of education,
right,
of this encounter of persons. And that's how he viewed our relationship with God, as this personal encounter. Heart speaks to heart was his motto. And so it was not emotional, right? The emotions play a role, but they're integrated. And ultimately, even the mind is ordered towards God, which transcends it. And so I would say that Catholic education, following from Newman, is about this proper integration of body and emotions towards the mind to be directed by them in reason. And that reason ultimately, when it is rightly ordered, will assist us in ascending to God.
Right.
And that all of these things are necessary. So it's actually an error to say, well, we just have to go to God. We don't have to pay any attention to the emotions, to the body, and to the mind. And I think Newman really challenges us to say education matters if we're Catholics. A rightly ordered mind, which helps to rightly order the emotions, is very important in happiness. But that everything is ultimately ordered towards this encounter with God in the heart, and which is not an emotion, but it's the deepest center of who we are.
Well, Jared, I want to say thank you very much for making the time to talk with us about all this.
Absolutely. It was really a pleasure.
My guest has been Dr. Jared Staudt. He is the author of Words Made Flesh, the Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education. This is published by CEP, and I recommend that we all procure a copy to read it, to think about Catholic education, to think about how we form the souls of our children and our loved ones. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.